You're listening to the Decentered Media Podcast with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, it is Friday the 20th of February. I'm Rob Watson and this is a Decentered Media Podcast, and today I am with Samir, and we've just had this conversation about, it instantly goes out of my head how to pronounce people's surnames, so apologies. Can you tell us if you pronounce your surname for me? And by the end of the conversation, I promise I'll have learned how to pronounce it.
Well, that's quite all right, Rob Watson. It's Samir Padania.
Thank you very much. It takes about 10 times for it to fit in. I go back through all of my podcasts and it's never right. And it's like, so I've embraced it as a quirk. So we're here today to have a conversation about the report that you co-authored for Demos about the future of the BBC. And it's entitled, let's see if I got my webpage up with a copy of the report. It's Our BBC, a blueprint for more independent and future-proofed BBC. It's always good to start off, I think, before we jump into the report, is tell us a little bit about yourself and what your kind of involvement as a media analyst, how that's come about and what your experience is and what's your journey been like.
What are my credentials? So I am not a journalist by training, not a sort of newsroom journalist, but I've worked in and around journalism and done bits of journalism, but mainly in and around journalism to support it in various ways over the length of my career. So I started, originally I wanted to work in documentaries, so I sort of worked as a documentary researcher, but then I worked at an organization called Panos in the early 2000s, which was the Panos Institute, and it had offices around the world, that were essentially, it was a sort of ended up being a decentralized network, everybody sort of equal status, Zambia and Haiti and South Asia and wherever. And that was focused on supporting independent public interest media around the world to strengthen informed, inclusive public debate. And that was really the kind of grounding that got me into this field, and I was there for a long time, like 6 years, worked in lots of different things, but also saw firsthand, how the internet was affecting in various different ways what was going on for journalism in lots of different societies around the world. And so that was then, that was the first major sort of long job that I did. Then I worked at Witness, the human rights organization in New York, for 3 years, where I ran a sort of project that was effectively the sort of YouTube for human rights. It was the first online space designed from a human rights perspective to take all this sort of footage, the kind of stuff that we're seeing, the sort of the documentation that's happening in Minnesota and so on, and everywhere around the world. It was the first attempt to go, okay, what is this stuff? How do we categorize it? How do we think about this new world of what was then called UGC, user-generated content, and to put a human rights frame on it? So, that was, interaction with big tech, seeing the power of the platforms, seeing the sort of power and the need for imagery and truth and reality to be contextualized, and how you do all of that work. So quite forensic work in a way. Beginnings of how you use all that stuff in even legal proceedings and so on. And now I came back to the UK and worked for Open Society for 4 years as a grant maker, Open Society Foundations, in their what was first called the media program, then was the program on independent journalism. And so that meant making grants in areas like media policy, sort of different kinds of journalism organizations, and then eventually in sort of journalism startups, experimentation, innovation, the kind of new frontiers of what was going on in journalism. And I left that almost, in fact, about exactly 10 years ago. And since then, I've been sort of independent come freelance, and I've worked in lots of different settings, but really doing 3 or 4 different things. One, working on the funding environment. How do you improve the funding environment for journalism, for media policy, for healthy information generally? And that's obviously, 10 years ago, we were in one place. 10 years on, obviously that landscape looks entirely different. But in a sense, the sort of resourcing constraints, whether it's done through philanthropy or public money or, private equity or whatever means, we need to be thinking about all of those continuously as ways of strengthening the information environment, strengthening journalism, and so on. Then I also think about how you build actual funds. So I've done, different work on sort of how you build funds. I was part of the Nesta Future News Fund a few years ago, short-lived, sadly. And I've co-wrote a paper that was about how to build national journalism funds that's been used in lots of different countries around the world as a sort of part of how they've tried to build their own national funds for journalism. And worked a bit with the International Fund for Public Interest Media. So, from very sort of international level, all the way down to setting up the first local news fund in the UK, which was in Newry, sort of participatory local news fund that was in Northern Ireland, in Newry, and that was with the Public Interest News Foundation. And then that's led into some work that's kind of place-based, really, looking at cities and places and how they handle. Often, we talk at quite an abstract or national level about media and how it impacts and what we need to do with regulation and policy and funding and so on. But the reality is people are in places, the pandemic, I think, particularly forced us to think about this a lot, and what that local layer is, how you interact with information in your own community and where you are. And if you think back to the pandemic, in a way, it seems almost like quite an innocent time in information terms compared to where we are now, where, you've got hybrid information warfare happening and all sorts of, AI generated publications at the local level and things like that. Back then it was, there was sort of slop and crap, but, quite a lot of the time humans were producing it. So I think, that's the other area where I've really been looking quite a lot recently at how, how to bring people together at that local level to think about, think about the common interest about quality information at the local level, really. These are the sort of threads that kind of weave through all the way through, really. But,
it's like I always describe it almost like strings on a guitar. You pluck one and there's a resonance between the others as well. So these kind of correspond across different applied domains. Would you think of yourself as a systems thinker, or what? How would you describe yourself if you're right? Because you're thinking strategically. Your experiences taught you about strategic approaches to meet to this issue.
You try, but I think the systems are also incredibly entrenched and difficult to change. So I think that I see a lot of systems thinking that is, you can't argue with it as an end goal. But I think the challenge is really, how do you get from where we are now, entrenched compounding capital, inequality of wealth, inequality of information, concentration, and all of these sorts of forces. How do you get from that position, which is incredibly asymmetrical already, plus we're going into a world where hard power is, being flexed again, might is right and all of that stuff. So in that world, how do you get from where we are now to closer to that sort of, alternative system, better system? There are things you have to go through on the way. And so I think there's a mixture of, like, I would say, across all of that work, I try and be as pragmatic and practical as possible. There are affordances in the policy environment. There are things that individual media organizations can do. There are things that funders can do. It's very, very difficult to get all of those things moving in concert at the same time. But there are pivotal things that you can affect that maybe will have a ripple effect that helps you keep pace with some things, right? I think, we're perennially under-resourced in the public interest field. Partly it's like we overwork, so we're under-resourced, but also it's still, sort of constraint or throttling of resources or reduction of resources historically. So it's, we're at the end of a long period of austerity in this country, let alone what the conditions are in lots of other places where I work and have done. So I think, try and think in as systems a way as possible, because you have to know where you're navigating towards and you have to have the sort of North Star. But if you're not dealing with the actually existing things that are in front of you, then it's very, very difficult. You can articulate lots of visions. And I think, in the report, we've tried really strongly to go, well, there are these visions out there of, more independence, better accountability, citizen involvement, and so on and so forth. How do we actually get there? If you were to actually play each of these things out, in your analogy, the guitar, if you were to compose a piece that used different chords and different notes and things like that, how would you actually get to that end piece without it sounding like a sort of, what it sounds like when I actually play a guitar, which is really, really, you don't want to be there, So I think that's one of the things. And I think the other thing that I'd say in terms of how I got to this, to be involved in this thing, is that I think, when these are constants in my work, and there are things that I've said, people I've worked with have said, that when I was a witness, we were saying many of these things and we were warning about them. Concentration of power, particularly among the tech companies, outstripping the ability of any public interest bodies to sort of counteract it, the sort of sometimes craven response of governments and so on to, in the face of tech power and the sort of promise of technology and all of that sort of stuff. But, in a way, I feel we've been very, very siloed in how we look at these things. So, even within our silos, we are siloed from each other, or we are fragmented, and that's just, there's lots of reasons for that. I think, there's funding demands, a need to differentiate and all of those sorts of things. And then, there are genuine substantive differences. But I think when you look at the basic commonalities, we, as a sector, from the very, smallest organizations all the way up to the top, broadly speaking, I think you could find a lot that we agree on. And I think that marshalling that has not happened in the past as much as it could or should have done. There are many really, really strong initiatives that could have had momentum behind them, could have had better coordination, could have had more solidarity behind them, and perhaps they would have made a bigger dent, built momentum in ways that could have helped us build the power in a different way. I don't think that that's happened, but I think where the re-election of Donald Trump, and then the very, very blatant convergence with tech power and foreign policy and sort of, muscle flexing of different kinds has, I think, some people recognized it very early. Others are kind of coming to it later. But I think that frame, and I think in Demos's case, the frame of epistemic security particularly, I think it offers a cross-cutting analysis that many, many people find resonance in a way that maybe before, when they were told, well, look, journalism is really important and you should support it, or, whatever it might be. Universal broadband is really important and you must, all of the libraries. Why do we not have more libraries? Oh, well, libraries, do people really use them? All of that sort of stuff. You can get all that stuff online, physical spaces, lots of different things that matter to people really, but they were sort of fragmented across lots of different domains and never really seen as a whole. Our policy agenda has never really done that. But in the US, weirdly, they did, like 15 plus years ago, nearly 20 years ago. There was a sort of Aspen, I think it's Aspen, I forget what it's called, Aspen Institute or whatever it's called. They did a report with the Knight Foundation that was called The Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy. That was like 2007, something like that. And I think that as a way of looking, in a way, it's kind of an epistemic security report. did for the US environment, it said all of these things are important. Journalism, media, civic connection, libraries, broadband infrastructure. And so as a sort of common umbrella, it brought together a lot of these things. And I think that what's happening now under the way that Demos has sort of marshaled this epistemic security network and the analysis, and the way that they've looked at sort of big picture things, but also very local things, I think is a very perceptive thing. And so that's how, and I've been involved in that over the past year plus, I guess, since it started. And then, to get the opportunity to work with Hannah Perry and Polly Curtis on this report, and some of the wider Demos team, and all the people that, all the allies in the wider field, British Broadcasting Challenge and other groups, MRC and others, who are all, have all been thinking about these issues for a long time. There was a particular frame that we felt, needed to be articulated. And it was this epistemic security premise, that the information environment we're in is different. So in a sense, lots of the different threads of where I've come from, although they seem possibly slightly tangential to a report about the BBC, they're sort of intrinsic, because they're all about how this globalized, highly financialized, asymmetric information environment affects the provision of quality information to people who deserve it as a human right, essentially.
But you articulate it really well. It's a dynamic process rather than a mechanical process, and the danger is that a thing can often retain its mechanical cause and effect kind of models, which is, if even work, and I say a good idea must be able to work both forwards and backwards. It's so if we have the BBC, we protect ourselves from information risk. But if we lose the BBC, then we expose ourselves to information risk. And testing that kind of idea is important, of being able to look at it and say, well, what's actually going on here, and how does this actually work, and in what context, so that take into account that changes in technology, changes in global the globalization model and experience, all those kind of factors. Tell us a bit more about how the report is framed in terms of, this term epistemic, it's kind of quite an academic term. What in general terms do you use? And you can write PhDs about what the definition of epistemic means. But what's your general kind of rule of thumb when you're explaining to somebody what that means?
Well, I try and when I'm explaining it to somebody, I try and dumb it down as much as possible by using the term hermeneutic.
Very funny.
No, I think in a way, I think the framing that and I think everyone acknowledges that it's, in a sense, it's, it sounds a little bit like an arcane term, but I think the value of that is that it sticks. It is something, even if you can't pronounce it, you recognize it. And I think that it says exactly what it means, which is that I think if you understand the word epistemic coming from the word for knowledge in Greek, in the same way you have food security, you have cybersecurity, you have national security, these all imply having an understanding, a systemic understanding of how this thing exists and is produced and shared in your society, and what systems you have to protect the chain by which that spreads in your society. It's something that's fundamental to your ability to function. If we don't have food security, this entire, society will completely collapse, right? And there are lots and lots of systemic risks to our food security. I don't know if you read there was a sort of report that was partly put out by the government. It was sort of intelligence assessment of the sort of climate risks to
my anxiety levels are high enough as they are. I don't need to be reading these reports all the time. But it's
I think I've probably had so much coffee that it's like it's indistinguishable from anxiety. So it's just like the natural condition in which I exist. Reading reports like this and going, oh yeah, I get that. So I think there's a if you think about it in terms of, in order for our democracy and society to function properly, in order for individuals in that society, groups in that society, to be able to participate, to be able to understand, ingest what's going on, understand the forces that are affecting them in their lives, you need a sort of reasonably secure enough and solid enough information supply chain, which has multiple levels to it, different kinds of actors. It's plural in the sense that you've got choices of different kinds of information, but the ways in which that information are produced are transparent to you. That you can, you have enough education to be able to understand, to be able to evaluate those things. You also have enough experience through your life. You are able to interact with and use that information to then make choices in your own life and in the lives of the people you care about and in the lives of your community and your nation eventually, right? So I think that's essentially what we mean by epistemic security, in the sense that there are, and the media is one part of that, but it's not the only part. You're talking about knowledge institutions, science, rule of law is essentially, in a way, an epistemic thing. It's a predictability of how the law will treat everybody equally, and there are predictable things that happen, and what is evidence, and all of those sorts of things, right? But in the particular lens that I come at it from, of course, I look at a lot of different issues related to public interest, a lot of issues related to the sort of broader information environment. But one of the ones where I'm, if you like, more specialized is around, what is happening to media organizations of all kinds and all levels and all funding models and all, revenue models in that environment. And so, within the way that Demos has framed epistemic security, to them, there's, two particular areas where there is, a real risk and a real opportunity. One is around the public service media. These are like, if you look at, I forget the latest figure that, whatever the EBU's figure was, but, of like aggregate expenditure on public service media across the space that they cover. So Europe, but it's more than just the EU. It includes the BBC and everything else. And so if you look at that, it's, tens of billions that is spent across the European space. That's a lot of money, a lot of investment in national information infrastructure. If you think about it that way, it's not just strictly, as much as all of those things matter, they do matter to people because it's how they personally interact with the service or whatever. But the sort of bigger picture of what that represents across all of these issues is where we sort of, in a way, in our report, coming from an epistemic security frame, we sort of say, you've got an information ecosystem, everyone is in it all the time, and it's increasingly all parts of life, all parts of policy, all parts of services, all parts of everything pretty much are digitalized and, mediated through digital technologies of one kind or another. We carry personal devices that are constantly monitoring us and, leaking information about us and all that kind of stuff. In that context, where, you have to look at what the role of that thing is. In our case, it's the BBC, and understand what, yes, it was designed for a particular thing 100 years ago, and it's gone through periodic evolutions. What do we need to do now that is fit for purpose for the times that are here and the times that are coming? Not fighting yesterday's battles. The environment we're in is different, and we have to, and it's really the sort of environment in which the epistemic security program is kind of rooted in. A lot of the network of civil society and academics and in other institutions and funders and so on are thinking about a lot in aggregate. There's lots of stuff, it's not just about media. There's, the elections bill and all sorts of other aspects that are really critical pieces of, whether it's legislation or policy or whatever it might be, that network is thinking about. So that's why it was really, to me, a sort of exciting opportunity to try and offer a new frame, to this, to how you think about public service media in the current environment.
You explain that really well. I think the obvious question that comes to mind is, how do we know when we haven't got epistemic security? what does that feel like? And then also, I kind of fully agree that I think the perhaps it's been because of the marketization of media, which is fine. I don't have I'm a pluralist and I'm a capitalist and wherever else, social democrat, wherever you want to call it. It's like I'm not policing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have markets, but the kind of we've given away the tools that we had to develop security, to maintain security. And we've kind of taken our attention away from that and thought that we could coast on the globalized economic model, if you like, and that would provide lift all boats, as they say. But actually, we've not paid attention to the harbour wall. We've not paid attention to to those things that give everybody that secure setting in which they can birth at any particular time. So for what I suppose the big question is, and it kind of I wonder if the framing of this might not be the right way to do it. It might be a cart before the horse or a horse before the cart. I'm not sure. Did you have discussions when you were thinking about the report about what kind of, because there was a thing that Tim Davie talked about a while ago, long before the controversy blew up, and he said, and it was kind of one of the few things I agree with him on was we have to decide what kind of country we want to be, and then we figure out what kind of BBC we want to work in that. With the other discussions, so you've mentioned things like kind of security is a crucial one. Self-determination is the purpose of security, and information security is part of that. Inequality is a risk, and I agree. You sound very pragmatic about that, and that I regard myself as a pragmatist in that sense. I'm not trying to drive an ideological idea first. I'm looking at this and saying, what's the foundational provision that a state or a society needs to put in place to ensure social cohesion, social security, welfare, information security, those kind of things, epistemic security, if that's what it's called. So that's a jumble of kind of half-formed questions. But is there a sense that you had an idea of what kind of society you want to consider to be, and then that drove the direction of the report, or was it something that emerged out of thinking through, well, if we put these kind of systems in place, this is what kind of society we're going to end up with? Or this is the framework that we have to deal with?
I think that the fundamental motor of the report is, how do we strengthen the independence and accountability of the BBC? I think if you look at the BBC and you try and understand what it is, it's very hard because it occupies so many different levels and parts of civic life, public life, media life. Such a multifarious.
Can I just sorry for interrupting. Yeah. I just want to push back on one thing on that, actually, if you don't mind. I'm not an interrogative journalist, so it feels odd to say it. But is that for the BBC's sake, or is it for that British citizens? How do we strengthen the independence of British citizens? And what role does the BBC play in that? That for me is the fulcrum point often with this discussion.
Sure, but I think that then that's a bigger and different report. This is really focused on a policy moment, which is they're asking, what should we do with charter renewal, right? There's a very practical thing, which is the BBC, unlike any other organisation with a royal charter, has to sort of argue for its existence every roughly 10 years. Not everyone understands that. So I think that is one massive thing that, like, when people go, what? When they understand that actually every 10 years this organization has to argue for its own existence, and it's doing that in a progressively more and more hostile environment. One where, if they had said there have been discussions about this for quite a long time, and it's kind of, it's been floated, but it's kind of been as a problem. But this is the first time where you've got an overwhelming drumbeat of everyone saying, we've got to stop. We've got to, this cycle of every 10 years is ridiculous because it's, it's costly. It distracts the organization from what it should be doing, which is serving the British people, right? And fulfilling what you just said, right? How do you make this society more legible, more accountable, more transparent, more fun, frankly, et cetera, for all the people who live here, whether they're citizens or not, and I think that is a really important distinction, because there is a policy process that is happening right now. And the reason that that's important is not because it's a media policy issue, but this is important because the BBC is a symbol of how we want our country to be and what we want to get out of it, how we communicate with each other and all of that stuff, right? So in a way, it's not that we went, of course, there are background things like you're saying, that there is this link between, there's a sort of underlying assumption of, there is a sort of, it's more than a social contract. It's a sort of almost a rights, it's a part of the rights framework in a way, the human rights framework of everyone who's here, that the government has agreed through the provision of the BBC and the wider PSB system and so on, to guarantee a minimum level of information, quality information that has some safeguards around it and standards around it, and a way in which you sort of oversee and regulate that and make it democratically accountable, that was unique and that has become a global model, right? For how you might choose to do this in a society. And so that, in a way, we're like, we talk a little bit about that, but that's the history and the roots and the sort of DNA of this kind of contract or framework or whatever. But the assumptions in the world have periodically changed. We've been through the Cold War in that time. We've been through the Second World War in that time. We've been through the Great Depression and all sorts, global financial, all sorts of crises have affected society that are far bigger than that institution. But that institution has endured and been pivotal through all of those moments. And yeah, it's made mistakes, but any organization makes mistakes. It is unique in the way that it is structured to force it to account for those mistakes. And it has this mandate, and it has this mission and public purposes that are written into the charter that are, it's a charter intentionally because they sort of thought it gave it a special status that was sort of beyond politics. You create this thing that is for the public and for the people, and then it has to be beyond politics. You can't have politicians having a chokehold over it. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, that's a really good point. Go on.
So I think in that, and that was, it's more, I forget how the way that's, it's more, it's more noted in the aspiration than the observance, if you like, right? But it's become so nakedly clear in the last couple of rounds of dealing with, particularly the last government, the Conservative government under, where there was a sort of austerity approach. And then you can see, and we talk about this in a bit more depth in the report, with 2010, 2015, these negotiations sort of brought to the fore why it's dysfunctional. You have an increasingly, a sort of board that has direct political appointees in it effectively, which has played out in this most recent Trump edit crisis. You've got chokehold over the funding model. So, the government is the one that decides all of these things. This isn't the BBC that exists and decides what it wants to do, and then the government gives an opinion. The government decides all of it. The government writes the legislation, decides what's in the charter. It deals with, what the exact funding model will be. And the BBC essentially goes, it puts in its views, considered views based on all sorts of feedback and input and its own experiences and, its vision of the future and all of that kind of stuff. But ultimately it's the government that decides, and that's this consultation. So that's why that consultation and the practical issues of what that offers opportunities to argue and help reframe the debate is where I think we're at. That this is a moment at which you have to look at that and go, okay, this is in the world that we exist in, and in the world that, frankly, in the last sort of 15 months or whatever it is, has become increasingly nakedly apparent to everybody, that our information ecosystem, the way that most people in the UK access information, the systems on which they work, the ways in which they share and engage with their friends and family, and online, the devices on which they're working, an overwhelming amount of this is foreign owned and largely US owned. And we've seen how that is now more and more closely allied to, for whatever reasons. In some cases, it's clearly a sort of political and ideological agenda. In other cases, it's a purely commercial decision. Expedient, working with an administration to maximize your opportunities. But that has ripple effects for us. And you've seen it in the trade deal, and you've seen it in, content moderation decisions, and you've seen it in the Grok nudification challenges, and you've seen it in, with child sexual material online and all sorts of different elements. And when you read back, I think everyone, there's been enormous numbers of people, digital rights community, particularly, but lots of people in civil society and so on have been trying to fight on this front. We're now at a point where I think it's apparent to everybody, the climate people, the science people, the law people, the media people, child rights, gender, LGBT, everyone is under attack in their own silos, but they've all, I think, finally the penny has dropped that it's this wider information ecosystem. Plus you've got, so that there's that ecosystem is the one in which we all rely on and our services rely on. So it's not just the media issue. It's a kind of, it's like our systems.
Yeah. I was going to say, is that a bit like a fish complaining that the water's wet?
No, it's complaining that the water is being,
I suppose polluted is the word that is probably the most appropriate, and there's sort of substances in the water, and it doesn't have any say over how the water. Sure. Okay.
I mean, but I think that the thing is actually we do have some control, and so from our perspective, that investment in the national information infrastructure that is represented by PSB or PSM is the sort of bedrock of being able to make the wider information ecosystem, which includes local and independent media, community media, which includes, civic information, which includes all kinds of, arts and culture. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk at the Remix London Summit, where I was talking about the commonalities between the arts and culture sector and what they're undergoing and what we're undergoing in the independent, local and public interest media.
You've flagged up a couple of issues. I want to go back to one, which is the what's wrong with democratic oversight and accountability with elected representatives having a say, a guided say, let's put it that way, over the BBC, because ultimately the sovereignty of Parliament it takes priority. Yes. And I've heard other commentators who support the BBC kind of describe, the here today, gone tomorrow politicians. And it's kind of like, well, actually, that's disrespectful of the democratic process. And we ought to be able to elect representatives that can express a view. If politics is dirty and politics needs cleaning up, that's a different issue than whether the politics should have a say about the BBC.
No, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying that it's wrong for politicians to have a say or oversight. It's absolutely right that there should be delegated democratic authority. This is an enormous expenditure and an enormous piece of infrastructure that the British public are told they have to pay, right? It's not a tax, but many people experience it as one. Or they are taught to think of it by some people as a tax, right? So in a sense, there's this relationship, there's a discourse about it that's partly come from our politics. But what we're looking at is not that wider discourse necessarily. We're looking at the actual mechanics of how do decisions get made about the BBC. At the moment, you have, the sort of charter process renewal is essentially run by and driven by the government Secretary of State. Then you've got a midterm review. You've got various different institutions, the National Audit Office and Ofcom and so on, that all have processes of scrutiny over the BBC. Rightly, there should be good and rigorous scrutiny of the BBC. However, what I think, when you look at that system and when you talk to people in different parts of that system, both in the scrutiny infrastructure and within the BBC, what you realize is that it's created this constant sort of panopticon within which the BBC is operating, of scrutiny and of watching for tiny mistakes and blowing those tiny mistakes up into huge political things, things that would have been an editorial error that would just have been, in a newspaper, newspapers or other news media organizations, they make, comparable level sort of editorial errors all the time. They publish a correction. Sometimes if it's a really egregious case, but in the BBC's case, because of this combination of factors and that there are ideological opponents of it, then that gets blown up. And then there are sort of, some of that does happen in our politics, but more, what we tried to understand and try to unpick was how are, for example, governance decisions made? Who is on the board decided? How could that be made more independent and transparent? Is that something that absolutely needs to be decided by a minister alone? Is that something that should be under ministerial discretion? We think not, because ultimately, going back, like I said, this is about independence and accountability. And at the heart, the independence is about editorial independence and creative independence and operational independence of the BBC. That is why that is there, because it acts in the public interest above all things. It is above politics. It is above all these other things. It exists as an information structure and actor whose job is to, in part, without, as they say, fear or favor, address things in a courageous and bold way, creative way. It's almost in some ways, it's almost a sort of experimental thing, constantly evolving, because that's its job. It sort of incarnates the public interest in a very real way. And so in order to have that facility, that capacity, it needs certain things to be in place. It needs adequate funding. It needs, freedom from political interference. It needs access to sort of an understanding of the landscape and technologies, and a capacity to develop new ones and to embed the public interest in those, whatever new technologies are coming, as it has done for 100 years. And it needs a relationship with the public. And so what we have done with the report is to, in a sense, understand that set of principles that allow the BBC's internal things, which we don't go near. We're not making, we're not opining on sort of the nature of the editorial processes or anything like that. That's A, a different report, and B, probably different people who need to think about that, right? But what we can do is think very clearly about, if you are going to create the space for the BBC to do that, how can you do that in a way that is practical, builds on the system that exists and introduces new elements that allow the BBC to continue to be accountable, responsive, but have security of tenure, if you like, like an academic, in a way that sort of, they know that they've got a long, long time.
Well,
their existence is guaranteed.
Nobody's talking about abolishing the armed forces, are they? Nobody's talking about the health service might be modelled in different ways, but it's essentially, we need a healthcare service. I suppose that one of the things that kind of I think narrows this debate a little bit is about the focus on information, rather than the wider sense of cultural enrichment. And I think the epistemic model, in a way, is you're absolutely right. I agree with you about the threats and the need to have something in place. But to deliver news, we've always used this argument is in the past, to get large audiences to news, you have to provide entertainment. And there is a bit of the, I agree with you about the strictly fallacy. And there are many people who think that,
I don't think it's a fallacy. I don't think it's a fallacy. I think those things are
I've experienced
important.
it. There's people, I gave evidence at the House of Lords a few years ago, and I was asked a question by a bishop, and whose name I can't remember, was, well, the BBC is really popular because 9 million people watch Strictly. Yeah, but 61 million more people don't watch Strictly. What you're doing is you're extrapolating your experience from your social group to then justify something for everybody else. And I like the idea. I think what is really good in the report is that stepping back from this and looking at it, at the meta questions and the systemic questions that then connect these things. And I just wonder that the cultural enrichment question is kind of really important to be, and it's touched on, but it's not it's often one that's kind of it's about your sense of identity, it's about your sense of social purpose, it's about your sense of kind of belonging, all of those kind of things that bring people together in a cohesive society, however that is expressed. And we want that to be expressed creatively and with independence for those people who are engaged in this creative process as well. But that I often find that my colleagues who particularly focus on journalism are obsessed with news reporting and information management, and they forget that you need a popular, idiotic, crazy set of programs to deliver people to the, you need Morecambe and Wise to deliver 20 million people to a news bulletin.
But that's what I meant when I was saying earlier about the multifaceted nature of the BBC. If you reduce it to news, of course, that is an unbelievably important function in this moment. Having high quality information that is sourced in the most rigorous forms possible, that is tested, that is, that has incredible decades and decades of editorial expertise, although quite a lot of that is because of the sort of funding crisis, is always under pressure and so on. But it's still incredibly high quality. And it's not just domestic, it's international, right? So it's also an anchor globally and therefore a target globally. But that's one dimension of what the BBC does. It does all sorts of other things. And like you say, in an individual's life, they may interact with particular things. You have, one of the things I was looking at recently was, there's a lot of stuff about how young people don't care about the BBC, don't understand it. Actually, the usage levels on things like sounds and of individual podcasts or programs is really quite high. They might not watch linear TV at all or ever. They might not even watch things on iPlayer. They might watch them, but they watch the content, or some of it in other settings, when it's picked up after the rights window on Netflix or wherever, right? So it's not that people, I think we had to sort of abstract ourselves a little bit from those trenches, because I think you can get lost in those arguments and lose the bigger principle. And while we've tried to tether the big principle to practical things, how will this, if we address this principle, and this principle, how will that have practical implications for how the BBC can operate in the future? How might this change the footing on which the BBC does things for young people, things for rural people, things in AI, things in there are a bunch of different things that it could do differently if it weren't constantly going. At the moment, this time limit on the charter, for example, is a major issue. I think everyone agrees that's unworkable. It should at least. Most people think. I think it should have the time limit removed, and then that allows it to think more clearly, right? If you think, I don't know if you watched Lost. Did you watch Lost? When they have that button and they have to press the button every however many seconds or minutes or hours or whatever.
Yeah,
and reset, right? If you think about the panic that induces, that's basically what the BBC has to do every few years. And the expenditure of that, the chilling effects, the drift and everything else that happen because of that are things that impact practically on editorial. They impact on creative freedom. They impact on risk-taking and choices. They impact on what services they prioritize or don't prioritize, things that they close. So, because they're having to demonstrate this thing all the time, they can't think strategically in the long term because they're having to react to these windows of political opportunity. And so if you remove that, but then, the concern that some people have is, well, if you remove that and you give the BBC a forever charter or a perpetual charter or whatever, like all the other organizations that have a charter, you're basically telling it, you've got carte blanche to do what you want. That's not true, because it has these mechanisms for reviewing its strategy, for reviewing its budgets, for reviewing its performance in some ways. Not performance on the level of, was this program a hit or not? Was this a flop or not? But on the level of, has it delivered against its mandate and its purposes? Big picture delivery, not micro delivery. It's not accounting. And then if you have that, you have a sort of higher level charter, which is permanent. And then you have a proper framework whereby you can be responsive to circumstance. You can be responsive to technological change, social change, demographic change, whatever it might be. And you have a periodic way of reviewing that and changing, not the charter, but of changing the framework by which it's operationalized. Then I think you have a better balance, like a normal organization, not this sort of periodic psychosis that happens where they're like, oh my God, we have to navigate through this sort of political moment. It becomes less of a political moment and more of a strategic moment, which then I think makes it much more generative, if you want to use a word like that, for the British public. The British public genuinely are in a situation where they are watching an organization and inputting into an organization that is trying to think, not, oh God, how is this going to land in number 10 or whatever, but how is this going to land in Salford?
I mean, to be
environs, the people, not Salford Media City,
Yeah, the kind of feedback loops that are built into this are quite important. But trying to frame this is in the past we've had a strong plural model, imperfect, and it was only for a short period, of commercial television, commercial radio, newspapers, cinema, and alternative providers of news and entertainment services to the public. And they've kind of withered away, or they've been globalized and corporatized and homogenized, and as we talked about earlier, they're largely run by global corporations now, and you don't have that local supply, that local independent determination of media anymore. So the BBC is kind of more exposed in a way, because you don't have those homegrown organizations and institutions that are relevant to people here and now. You're doing something, and for me, it's the question of how do we. There is a really interesting factor which we won't have time to get into, but I'd love to follow up at some point. Is about the information infrastructure that comes from the BBC. So, like making the information, like the algorithmic information that comes out of the BBC and they use in the public domain, and that's a public service to provide that, and to use the BBC as a way to provide, if you like, information management provision for, it could be a benefit for a social benefit for other providers to come in. Because I'm concerned that why do we need a national state-run institution to do this?
It's not a state-run institution.
Well, this is the argument that people say, and it's a quasi.
It's a straw man argument. It's a sort of intentionally fudging argument, which has to be repeatedly. Musk made it when he designated the BBC as a state media, and then they protested and he revised it.
Well, but it's a perception that's taken hold and many people resonate with. However, how do we support the diversification of supply in the media system? Because that then takes the pressure away from the BBC. If we've got, so my experience is I run an arts set up an arts radio station in Leicester, and it's going to have a slow process of development, but we've secured of funding for it, which we're grateful for. And but the BBC comes along and runs its BBC Radio 3 Extra service, whatever they've called it, and it's like, and the all the work that other independent providers could be doing suddenly gets it took away my business model. It took away the ability for me to claim that little niche that I was going to go after. It washed that away. So the power of the state is like, I understand with things like transport and trains are being renationalized because the economic model of it hasn't worked as it was thought it was going to work. But then a lot of the train services that are being provided on a free market basis, like the European services, are states who are, the Italians are going to run additional services through the Channel Tunnel, that kind of thing. So there's who is and how people are providing these things has to be done at a certain level. I'm a distributionist, so what can we push down with media to the lowest level? And citizen engagement, citizen participation, not just in the governance of the BBC, but in the production of the media ecology and the system and the platforms that go out there. And I just wonder, just kind of how is the technology going to be present us with some big challenges before we start to, what are we taking account of for that in that 10 years, 20 years into the future? We need to think about.
I think what you have to do is you have to create the conditions for that to be possible, right? So this is why, what we do in the report is to talk about the governance, the charter. So you've got constitutional level things where if you guarantee this thing's existence, and if you within that say this thing needs adequate funding, which is what, the European Media Freedom Act says, and other, Germans have it and others, other countries have this provision. So you sort of make certain things incredibly explicit. You say, this exists for these purposes. For the delivery of these purposes, we will guarantee it adequate funding. And then you say these things will be not determined by a government of the day. They will be accountable to a government of the day, but they won't be determined by a government of the day. So the board of the BBC will be determined by an independent appointments commission. The funding determination, like in Germany, will be determined by an independent funding commission. Right. And it will take evidence, including from the government and all the other bodies that I mentioned earlier, Ofcom and NAO and everyone else. And they will then make a judgment. That will be an expert panel properly appointed through the appointments commission. And they will do that. They will come out with a thing saying, okay, this is how much the BBC needs for the next funding envelope. Not this is what it needs next year. Not this is what it needs for 2 years, but this is what it needs for this period. And it has a guarantee of amount of money. But as part of those purposes, it's possible to say that, they're under discussion and organizations like PINF and others are sort of arguing very strongly, and I think rightly, that there should be a shift in the relationship between truly independent organizations and the BBC at the local level. And that does need to be renegotiated. I don't think it should be a panicked negotiation that sets in stone things for the next period. I think it should be a framework that then allows over time, with principles in place, which then allows over time, minimum level of kind of sort of responsibility on both sides. If it can't be properly negotiated, somebody has to step in. That's usually probably DCMS, or a regulator or whatever. But I think, I think those sorts of signals to show that the BBC is not there to, it's there as a sort of, in a way, there are assets the BBC has. It has, to the extent that studios and things like that are still important, for, people who are recording things off their laptops or their desktops or whatever, right? But some of that infrastructure is still important and some people want to use it. There are things like that. There's, space, printers, people working out of their back rooms or their bedrooms, or things like that. Then, the infrastructure of local news is very precarious and thin. 1-2 person organizations that are producing essential stuff for their communities, whether it's, investigations or arts and culture or about health or just about civic life or whatever it might be. That fabric is there and has been there for a long time. As you're part of it. community radio is incredibly important in this country, hospital radio, all of these different elements that are there. In Wales, you've got the Papwy Bro, the sort of local Welsh language free sheets that communities come together and create. There's all this fabric of local media, but policy has never really addressed it. Partly because I think there hasn't been this urgency of the information landscape panic, right? So I think in this context, I think this is concentrating minds, but I think it also requires, from the very local level, people to get organized and say roughly what it is they want, collectively. Because I think if, and this is why the consultation is important, understanding those impacts from, yes, a media perspective, but also a broader civic life perspective. There's attempts, to try and push back on, the Pride in Place program is an attempt to reinvent and rebalance some of the, some of the stuff around leveling up and, the roots of Brexit and all of these different things, right? And historical inequalities that have just been there for decades and decades and decades and never really dealt with. And I think one of the challenges is that has never really been done systematically and properly on the level of media, local media, independent media. There's been a complacent attitude towards, big media groups, media consolidation, all of that stuff I think is true. But what we're talking about in this process is what can you do to create the best conditions for the BBC to be able to act on that over time? You can't make a bunch of changes and then expect them to change overnight. It takes time. I mean, they have done, Middlesbrough, there's a space in the BBC building in Middlesbrough, the ground floor, I think used to be a furniture showroom or something like that. And then the BBC took it over and turned it into this kind of centre, which was open to the public and open to the local community. So it's not like things like this haven't been tried before, but the pressure of costs, the pressure of, the incentives under which all these different things are working are sometimes the wrong ones for the BBC to then make decisions that are, that would enable them to do things like that in a strategic way, but also a way that's kind of co-created with local media in different ways. So I think that there is room in that. And I think it's really important that people in the local independent community sectors do engage with this in the way that, okay, like what is it we would like to see? What is practical now? Where do we want to navigate towards? What are the things in these, whether it's ours or the British Broadcasting Challenges or whoever's proposals that we think, yes, we endorse those because those, broadly speaking, will help protect an environment in which what we want to see can happen. I think those are sort of important things to think about. It's those constitutional foundations. One of the things that we haven't talked about at all is this, aside from ending political appointments to the board by independent appointments commission, we sort of, on balance, we've come down to, look, sorry, I'm on a call. Sorry about that. Is
like
the supervisory board, conduct panel for the board, one of the challenges that's come up, all of these things that are sort of at the high level, the governance layer, need to be dealt with, right? Then you have this idea of guaranteed adequate funding, right? Which is important because that's what underpins the ability of the BBC to then make rational decisions and to allocate resources properly and not just have more and more things piled on it. If for example, the government were to say through this, well, now the BBC has to do a whole load of stuff for local and independent media and community media, but we're not going to give you any extra resources to do that. You're going to have to make cuts elsewhere. That's ultimately what will end in the ruin of the BBC, and it won't help the sector. So I think all of those things are important. But then the last thing that really we've particularly, we've heard from lots of different stakeholders that they want citizen participation in the BBC. It's we own it, we should have a say in it kind of argument, right? And I think a lot of people have sympathy with that instinctively. And also they've seen the growth of deliberative democracy from a kind of experimental thing, even, think back to the World Social Forum and things like that, right? now you've got an incredibly mature field with a huge amount of research showing the quality and benefits of deliberative practice, what's called deliberative reason, the quality of decision making, and all of that kind of stuff. So we have gone through in some detail in the report to articulate how and where that can make a difference. Crucially, it's not like audience panels or the other kinds of consultation that the BBC does around, audience preferences or, usability of the website, or, when they're proposing to shut off a service, or, whatever, it has all that legal stuff, legally mandated consultations they have to do. This is a different kind of thing, which is a sort of standing citizens panel, which is feeding into the board. And the board is taking high level decisions. It's not deciding about commissioning and things like that. And this body is the same. It's not saying, we think you should have a different host for Strictly. It's not that. It's not about content. It's not about complaints. It's about these high level strategic decisions and principles that govern the BBC and govern its kind of work going forward. And they essentially would have the capacity and the support to be able to ingest all of these things, to deliberate on them, and then to say to the board and the executive, this is having looked at everything you're proposing to do, having looked at your budgets, we make these recommendations. There may be 10, there may be 50, there may be 200. We don't know. It's up to that body. And then the board and the executive would have to respond. And many of them will be completely sensible things that, in with the best knowledge that that body has got, access to research, access to experts, access to the BBC board and leadership, all of that kind of stuff. They will then come out with these recommendations, some of which the board will just go, oh yeah, of course, that's a great idea. Thank you. Tick, tick, tick. And there'll be others where they disagree or they modify and they have to explain why, and in detail why. And that's called a comply or explain. In corporate governance, it's called comply or explain. And that's the principle on which this thing should work. And it should be done publicly, because the body that we're talking about is not a sort of random selection of citizens in terms of, whoever's got money to participate or time and leisure to participate. This is a process that in deliberative democracy practice is called sortition. And they get thousands and thousands of invitations to participate sent out. Of all of those people who respond, then there's a sort of a kind of what's called stratification, which is done to pick a demographically representative set of people. We recommend somewhere like 100, 120 people that in aggregate represent the diversity of the country, geographic, different minorities, educational background, all kinds of different elements, social and economic status, and all kinds of stuff like that. And then that body effectively is the public. It embodies and incarnates the public. So it's not like, an audience panel, which is like we took a representative sample of the UK public and we asked them some questions. No, it actually becomes a microcosm of the UK public, and they have authority to call witnesses and this, that, and the other. They're given expert support to do that. So it's a bit different, and they're part of the governance, and they have to be answered. When they speak, they have to be answered. And the other element, and that's ongoing, and, sometimes they might be asked big picture questions. The board might say, okay, well, look, we've never actually asked the public what they think the public interest is, right? So that body could be asked to deliberate on the public interest. Come out with what you think the public interest is as the sort of embodiment of the UK public. This will be an important document that we will have alongside the BBC's own definition, right? It's not going to tell the BBC what to do, but it's going to say, this is what we think. And it gives the board and the BBC executive and BBC in general and society a view. It's like, this is what people who spend time together, get to know each other, have different political affiliations, different social backgrounds, different ethnic and minority characteristics and whatever, they collectively have deliberated and they've come to this set of trade-offs, right? It's not like a it's not like an opinion poll where it's like one slice in time. What do you think? Should the BBC be abolished or not? It's more about that. And then there's a second thing, which is as I've said, like the whole thing of the charter is to make the charter long term. In the future, there may be a government that has a large majority that wants to make changes to that charter. Some of those changes might be completely rational and fine, and nobody would argue with them. But there are some of those that might threaten the existence of the BBC or the fundamental characteristics of the BBC. So what you have to do in that case is we recommend invoking, like spinning up a separate one-off citizens' assembly, selected the same way, but then that would deliberate on what the government is proposing to do. And then it would have to offer, before the government can act or legislate, that body would need to table a report. It would need to deliberate and then table a report to Parliament. Then Parliament would consider that. All of the legislatures of the UK would consider that. They'd all have to vote, supermajorities. And then 3 years later, a second assembly would do the same thing, so that it isn't and this is quite a common practice in very, very consequential decisions like that are sort of, to do with getting rid of something, that has been a fixture for a long time, or changing your voting system or whatever. You need to have this time delay it's like a sort of air gap in a way, so that then you have one set of decisions, advice, and then a decision, and then another set of advice. And if the same decision comes through and all of them vote again, then fair enough. That's a democratic decision. Parliamentary sovereignty is upheld. But it's introducing an element of calm and deliberation to the process that counteracts what sometimes are incredibly rapid political moments that can sweep away institutions without due consideration. So I think that's one of the things that we feel is crucial. And also what that speaks to is this kind of relationship of trust. People talk about trust and, trust is eroded. And I think, it's a whole other conversation. But I think in some senses, you have to demonstrate your credentials and you have to demonstrate your willingness to be vulnerable and to invite people in to discuss with you. And I think that vulnerability, we're in an era where that is possible with PSM.
The nature of if we use the high street as a model, as we mentioned, it was the anchor institutions. You get the big shops, and it's incredibly important because it defines what other shops might be in that area. So there is a role because it can produce content at scale and it can be seen externally.
But also, I think you have to. Sorry to interrupt, but I think also you have to remember that a lot of the work that's done, BBC does an enormous amount of consultation, audience research, and everything else. But in a sense,
well, I think you've
a lot of it is consumer.
Yes, and the point I was going to make is that with community media, we say it's 10% media and 90% community development. Now, we're not expecting the BBC to do that level of it, but there needs to be an introduction to the BBC that actually they are there for community development and that they offer services. It could be they offer additionality to their broadcast and media services that are also about civic literacy, civic skills, whatever it is, and that there is an element there of it changes the model of justification from a marketing model. I think the point that you were kind of. Well, I think
there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum. There is,
but there's a dependence. We know that decisions taken about BBC local radio have been done and widely opposed, but the marketing information that is used to justify them isn't entered into the public domain, and it isn't set up. Either a citizens' assembly would produce a different set of outcomes and a different set of values, and BBC local radio in England anyway would be handled in a very different way. So there's experience of that. Yeah. And you can see how it can benefit if you're taking those appropriate parts. I'm not saying you take every part of the BBC. Those that are appropriate, you can work within that.
Yeah, and it's framework. got to be aligned. I think it's got to come in a context where the footing on which the BBC its constitutional footing is not one of constant uncertainty.
There's a thought that comes to mind, which might be a bit flippant. Apologies, but I've reached the age now where seeing a intergenerational change for the BBC doesn't much interest me. But we need to get our next generations of licensed or supporters of the BBC enthused to support the model of the BBC. Because my immediate response would be to say, well, I'm not sitting and living through an extended bureaucratic process of regulating the BBC. In a month's time, I could have something set up for myself and just get on with it and do my own YouTube channel and start making my own films or something like that. It's not a static. And I think this is another conversation at another time, but it's not static. And that dynamic model of it is the exciting part of it. And what I'd kind of like to see a lot more is that embracing and that challenge of saying, I think the Demos report's really well laid out and systematic, but from government, I'd like to see some. I think the big mistake that was made was with, and a lot of things I lay at the blame of Osborne and Clegg and Cameron, was that the BBC was given an impossible job in the last charter renewal to be a global industries player, and they basically downgraded its role as UK civic institution, or as a foundational institution, as we discussed. And I think so it's set up to fail almost.
Yeah, for sure. The conditions in which it's been, it's been given, not just perverse incentives, but I think conflicting incentives.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're trying to do in this is to say, if you correct some of those things that are upstream of the decision making the BBC has to do, and the sort of societal contract between, it's a universalist organization, right? It's the only one in that way, other than the NHS, right? And it's universal in the sense that it genuinely has, in everything it is doing, to think about how this is going to impact literally everybody. It doesn't always meet that because it's had a 40% real terms cut in 15 years. And that a lot of that has happened also in the technology domain. It's 40% across the board. Some areas have had 60%, 80%, others have had less, right? So it's that fundamental characteristic of it having universality at its core, that also has to evolve in step with the times, or ahead of the times. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to say, is that if you think about universality, it's not just a one-way universality provision. There's got to be universality encoded within the BBC in the sense of the public as well, and the avenue that we're opening is through this citizens panel and the public lock that we talk about on fundamental changes to the BBC, through this one-off citizens assembly structure, which is a kind of emergency brake, if you like, right? Okay, somebody wants to destroy this thing. We need to call on the people to decide, because ultimately only not decide, but their advice needs to be before Parliament transparently, so that parliamentarians, although they are elected representatives, they can't necessarily invoke "we're doing this in the people's name" if the people as a constituted body also get to speak directly. So I think those sorts of things, I think, are much more current and contemporary ways of thinking about how universality evolves into this new information ecosystem that you talked about. So they are responsive
I get beginning to pick up a sense of, actually, maybe the word universality has run its course, and we need to think about social and cultural cohesive identity, inclusion. I don't know what the language is. There's a debate to be had, I think, following on from this, in terms of saying, well, what do we mean by universality? Because if that's the guiding principle of the BBC, then, and you mentioned earlier, and I think you're absolutely right about the BBC trying to salami slice every sense of sector, demographic profile, and provide a service for them, rural, urban, age group, all of that kind of thing.
I'm not informed enough to
and that might be counterproductive. I'm aware that I've taken up loads of your time, time. You've been really generous. I've got two kind of last questions to wrap up on. One is, what's the report been like? What's the feedback that you've had? How's it gone down? And secondly, how do people get in contact with you if they want to follow up and take up these issues with yourself and your colleagues?
So I think response has been really positive. I think, from all the different stakeholders that we've talked to, that have contacted us, that have wanted to talk to us about it and so on. I think there's 4 or 5 main things that we've had feedback on. I think there's a very, very widespread agreement that the time limit on the charter should be removed, or at the very least extended to a really, a generational period, minimum 25 years, if not longer. So I think that, there are certain things that I think everyone has agreed with. I think the removal of political interference in the appointments and in the funding, I think lots of people, even if there's sort of like nuances in the mechanisms, we haven't talked about what the funding model should be. We haven't gone near the license fee or household levy or anything like that. We certainly don't think there should be advertising on the BBC. And the subscription model also, we think, is sort of, not the right direction to go under, because all of these they militate against the idea of universality. They begin to create divisions between people, where actually the idea is that this is a universal service. So we've had feedback on all of those, and people broadly support that. I think the idea of guaranteed funding, I think most people see that as keeping step with international practice, and that actually the BBC could set international standards on that. And that in that frame, it would allow the BBC to act in a different way. So all these different pieces, I think in a way what people appreciated was the depth in which we went and tried to see, it's not just there should be a forever charter. We actually have run through what that actually means constitutionally, legally, in terms of, how it interacts with these other parts. What are once you give somebody a sort of forever charter, how does that affect accountability? What do you need to do to accountability and review and responsiveness and so on? And then what do you need to do? How does the funding work? And do you always have to decide before, or do you give them the funding and then evaluate afterwards, ex post or ex ante, right? All of these different things, the moving parts, we've sort of tried to game out and work out what is a good balance that is not Quangoifying the BBC, that allows it to operate with editorial and creative and operational freedom, that gives it security of tenure, if you like, and preserves and in fact strengthens the accountability that the BBC should have, because it's a publicly funded institution. We fund it. And that contract to reinvigorate it, whatever the funding model ends up being, we need to find a way to do it, because this is an absolutely critical capacity. And going back to the beginning of what we were talking about, I think repositioning the BBC within that frame, and others have done it as well. I think British Broadcasting Challenge particularly is kind of talked in this frame as well. We've all talking about it in terms of critical national infrastructure, and, the BBC's infrastructure as part of the cyber security and resilience frameworks. All of these different things are incredibly important. They seem really, really boring technicalities, but without addressing these things first, the stuff down the line, the editorial freedom, the creative, the programs you get to watch, what kids get to watch on their devices or whatever, religious programming, what rural people, farming program, whatever it might be, all of these different things, plus the stuff that happens with AI, as we didn't really go near, investments that the BBC can make, unless you get this other stuff right and you create it in a way where no single strike from an adversarial actor can take the whole system out, right? Which at the moment, the possibility is there for that to happen. So, unless you address that and you create a system where you are defending the BBC in depth, and one bit of contagion doesn't take out the whole system, which is what we think we've designed a sort of a version of. And we think that it's incumbent on the government to do that now, because the turbulence that is coming is going to be much, much, much more turbulent. in the information environment in terms of information war. The sophistication of what is happening already is pretty drastic. So we need to secure this facility, this capacity in our society, this institution, and then we can move from there, and we can make decisions. And but you need that foundational strength as a sort of basic set of conditions. Otherwise, things are going to get considerably worse, and the organization will be weakened if we treat it like we did in previous times, where it was, is the BBC too big? How do we cut the wings of the BBC in order to make sure that it doesn't impinge on others? Some people in this consultation have said to me, is the BBC big enough? To your question about being able to compete against these global giants, and it's not that will not have impacts at home, but at the moment, at least the impacts will be rooted in public interest principles, in accountability, in democracy. Whereas at the moment, all the impacts are coming from unaccountable, oligarchic, politically mysterious, ideologically, not to everyone's taste, unaccountable organizations that are headquartered abroad. And that's happening throughout our media ecosystem. So if we want a bit that we can control, and we can say, we genuinely have levers or buttons to push on this thing, and they mean it, and they really mean that they're in our interests, these are the kinds of reforms that we have to put in place. And I think that will cascade down to the local level, the independent level, the community level. It won't happen immediately, but I think these are the bedrock things that will allow the kinds of people that you've worked with all your career, that I've worked with intermittently in my career, to feel more confidence that, okay, we can see a new horizon opening up where we have opportunities, to dialogue with this institution in a different way. Otherwise, I think it's just a zero-sum game.
I think that's a really good final point. It isn't a zero-sum game, and that's the trick that some people want to kind of play on us. So you've been really thoughtful. You've been really generous with your time, and I really appreciate the kind of pragmatic way that you look at through things, rather than you're not taking an ideological. There might be something, we all have our perspectives, but it's not. It's open to discussion, which is what was the debate around this so far has kind of lacked, and it's nice to have that opened out.
But I think you do need people with very strongly held principles, and you need a spectrum of views and opinions. I don't think I think, and just like in any space, I've worked in the human rights sector, and you need people who will absolutely under no circumstances compromise, and will stand publicly and have huge public support for that, because it keeps everybody honest, and it shows you that there are truly principled positions. It's not that our position isn't principled, but it is deeply principled, but it's trying to look at, okay, there are these realities here that we have, in order to get to that, you need to work through steps to get there. And so therefore we have, and Demos is a cross-party think tank. It's not an ideologically driven think tank in that respect, other than believing that citizens, are key to all of this. So I think that's the premise from us, was to listen, understand the spectrum of opinion, work with and understand people who come from different perspectives, but who have great ideas. There are excellent ideas across the spectrum of the groups that are thinking, but this is a huge, crazed, huge organization with so many different facets to it. It's going to take a lot of people's ideas and input to ensure, and it needs sustained engagement, for that to happen. So yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. It matters to all of us. And then in order to get in touch, Demos you can write to hello@demos.co.uk, and they will generally respond pretty well. And then to get in touch with me, usually LinkedIn is probably the easiest.
I'll put links in the blurb, as they say.
All right.
You've been listening to a Decentered Media podcast with me, Rob Watson, and thank you very much, Samir. This has been incredibly thoughtful. If you want to follow more from Decentered Media, go to decentered.co.uk. I'm on all the social platforms at Decentered Media, I think. And if you want to support, I have a Patreon account that you can modestly chip in to help support and develop these podcasts as we go along. But until next time, thank you very much. You've been listening to the Decentered Media Podcast with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @Decentered Media.